Hey everybody, this is Papa Wiggs and Wiggs again. Now we're gonna dive into a wide receiver heavy strategy for a 12-man team league that has one QB, two RBs, two wide receivers, one tight end, a flex, a kicker, a defense, and seven bench players. So this would be a 16-round draft. Uh, um, that we'll be focusing on. So with that said, we'll dive right in. And Wiggs, you want to start?
Well, I think to start things on off, we do the clear cut number one pick here, wide receiver. This is really just a pick of your choice. You have a ton of options. It doesn't matter what position you're in. You have Hill, Chase, Lamb, St. Brown, Jefferson, another Brown, Wilson. You got Devontae Adams, Olave, London. You got a lot of options. So it's really just up to you what player you like the most. If it was me, I'd be picking between probably Chase, Lamb, Hill, and Jefferson, possibly St.
Depending
Brown.
on where you pick
Yeah.
in the draft. So yeah, and I agree. Round one, I'd be obviously in a wide receiver heavy strategy. I'd be looking at a wide receiver. You're definitely going to be able to get, depending on where you're drafting. If you're in the upper part of the first round, you're going to be looking at a Hill, a Chase, a Lamb, a Jefferson, a St. Brown. If you're in the bottom half of the first round, you'd be looking at, an AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, a Puka, Drake London, Devontae Adams type player. And then the second round, I'd be drafting another wide receiver. This again all depends on who drops down. You might have a Puka there from the Rams. Marvin Harrison, is going to be a hot commodity this year coming out of the rookie class. You could have a Brandon Ayuk or Chris Olave, one of those guys, there as well. Devontae Adams would be another one. This is where I'd be, depending on where you fall in the draft. Those are some of the names you could probably see in the second round.
In the second round for me, it kind of depends on what position you're at. You can really pick a wide receiver or a running back here, in my opinion, with the strategy. I'm always a big fan of at least getting myself like a top end running back. So I would personally say running back, especially if someone like Brees Hall or Bijan dropped to the second round, or if Kyren's still on the board, or Jonathan Taylor. I'd just like to lock myself down on RB1 still. Now, if you have an off chance of like someone like Jefferson or Brown or Wilson dropping down to you in the second round, go for it. Take a second receiver. Like, I don't blame you at all. Moving on into the third round, though, this is where I would go back to just taking straight up my wide receiver, making sure I'm sticking to my wide receiver heavy strat here. You can get anyone really from Ayuk to Drake London, Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, Mr. Consistent Mike Evans, which I would recommend highly in this round. DJ Moore, a lot of options.
Yeah, me personally, and Wiggs will probably tell you who I'm going to draft here. I would draft another wide receiver. I would cover, my flex at this point. I think in the third round, you're gonna have like a Debo, a Nico Collins, a Mike Evans, a DJ Moore, a Stephon Diggs, a Jaden Waddle. There's a lot of guys that you're gonna be able to lock down here. I know a lot of people would say you're crazy, Papa Wiggs. You're drafting three receivers in a row. I got a ring that says otherwise.
Fourth round.
Fourth round, this is where I'd finally look at drafting a running back. There's gonna be quality running backs that you can draft here. You could see somebody like a James Cook, a Joe Mixon, Rashad White, Kamara. Those are Walker. There's a lot of guys you can draft at running back here.
The fourth round, again, this is a spot where a certain running back drops down that you like, you can totally snag him on up. Like if White drops down or Kamara, who are both receiving running backs, so in PPR, they are nice to have on the team. So don't sway away from the running backs at all. If you are feeling like you can snag someone like Kamara or White who are receiving running backs, but me personally, I'd be going into this round trying to pick another receiver, and that would probably be someone like DK Metcalf or Amari Cooper, Malik Neighbors if you want a rookie on your team. You got T. Higgins, who's always consistent with Burrow. You got Keenan Allen. You got a bunch of options still. But again, if a running back drops down that you want, feel free to take them. It won't hurt because you can make it up in a different round. A lot more depth at receiver than running back. But moving into round five, I'd be picking up my backup or my RB2, I should be saying, running back here, locking myself down with just another running back, which could be anyone from like David Montgomery to Ramondre Stevenson, Swift, Jones, Pollard, Harris, whoever you feel the need to. But I would stick with probably like a Stevenson Montgomery.
Yeah, me again. I'd be going wide receiver, and I know some of you would be saying you're crazy. You're taking four receivers in the first 5 rounds. Listen, I could get maybe a George Pickens or a Metcalf, possibly Neighbors if he falls down, a Higgins or an Allen in the 5th round. I know a lot of you might say, well, this is just going to be your bench guy. Well, listen, if I get a solid bench guy and I didn't like any of the running backs that were there, or I didn't feel like I wanted to draft them that high, as Wiggs knows, I like to facilitate trades, and this is a good opportunity to get a solid wide receiver where you could potentially pull off a trade for a running back as well. And then in round 6, this is where I would look at getting my backup running or my RB2 running back. I think in round 6, you're still going to have some solid options there. You could snag a guy like Aaron Jones, Stevenson. You could possibly get Swift. You maybe be able to get, you know, some people might think it's a little bit high, but you might be able to get a guy like Zamir White. You have options there at running back that you can draft, and so that's where I would take a running back.
Yeah, for me in this round, I'd end up taking a wide receiver again. I'd be locking myself down with a bench guy who I could fill in at any point or trade, like you mentioned earlier. You still have a lot of good options here in the 6th round with wide receiver. You can go with a Kirk, or you can drop down and get like McLaurin, Addison. You got Godwin on the board still, who gets a lot of targets. You can even go further down and pick up a rookie in McConkey or Coleman. It kind of just really depends on what you want to do there. But I think snagging a backup receiver right here is really nice. And then moving into the next round, I'd probably sway more towards getting maybe a tight end if someone like Kittle or Ingram were to drop down to you. Um, or a quarterback. I'd say either one would work perfectly fine. If it was me in this position, I'd be locking myself down with a solid quarterback. You'd have Jordan Love or Brock Purdy, and a handful of other quarterbacks here in this spot.
Yeah, so for me, in round 7, this could go one of two ways. I might look at locking down a wide receiver that potentially dropped down, on my bench again that I could maybe potentially trade to somebody that didn't have a really good draft. But I would if a wide receiver didn't fall down here at round 7, I would probably look at drafting my tight end at this point. I think you're going to be able to get, like an Ingram, a Bowers. To Wiggs' point, you might be able, you probably you could possibly get a Kittle. The only way I wouldn't draft a tight end here is if for some reason there was a run on tight ends earlier and someone wasn't there. Then I would either look at doing potentially a wide receiver that maybe drop down, or I would probably do what Wiggs is doing and draft a quarterback. With that said, going into round 8, that's probably where I would look at a quarterback too. I'd look at a quarterback in round 8, depending on who was there. If somebody like a Jordan Love or a Purdy for some reason dropped down to round 8, I would definitely be drafting one of those guys for sure. I definitely think you could get, Tua at this point or a Jared Goff. Jared, some people might think that's a little bit high. I disagree. But Tua would be a good one. So I would probably look at a quarterback at this point.
Yeah, and then moving on into the next round here, I am back and forth between whether or not I want to get a running back or a tight end here. I think you could actually lock down a pretty solid running back here as your backup. You could also pick up a wide receiver here as well, which I might actually say I'm going to do. So I would go the route of a wide receiver here, lock myself down some more depth. Like I'd be taking a chance at tight end for sure, but a tight end to me is just kind of bonus points. So I think you can get away with just really having anyone if you're not getting those top five guys. So I'd say getting a receiver here in this round would be nice. You can get someone like Kelvin Ridley, Jaden Reed, Deontay Johnson. You got rookies still and Coleman, McConkey, Thomas. You got JSN. A lot of options out there in that eighth round. And then moving on into the ninth, me personally, I'd probably just get myself a backup running back here, like an Eckler, a Warren, Spears, Robinson. Lock myself some sort of depth here in running back without losing out on too many. I just think that would put me in a nice spot there, considering the fact I already have five receivers, I believe.
Yeah, so for me at this point, I agree with Wiggs. I would be looking at a backup running back, especially if there was someone like a Warren or Robinson, or Spears there. I would be looking at a running back at this point. And then round 10, this is where I would be looking at another wide receiver. Yeah, I know I've already got four, but this is a wide receiver heavy strategy. So I think in round 10, you could get a guy like Jameson Williams from Detroit, Sutton. You could get Dobbs, from Green Bay potentially Brian Thomas from Jacksonville, the rookie that falls down. There's a lot of guys that you could pick up here, to help fill out your wide receiver heavy strategy. So this is where I would pick up my next wide receiver.
Yeah, and then in this round, this is where I'd end up taking my tight end. I don't want to spread myself too thin there and not have a tight end on my roster, so I would play it safe here and end up snagging any one of like, you got a possible Ferguson or Njoku, Schultz, you got Goddard there from Philly, Fryermuth, Musgrave, Komet. You got a bunch of options still. They're not going to be your top five tight ends, but if they're not a top five tight end, realistically, they're all going to be pretty close in points, so you can get away with drafting a later tight end. And then moving on into round 11, this could go one of a few ways. You can really flex this around to whatever you want. You can grab yourself a receiver if you want a sixth receiver right now. You can grab yourself a running back if you're a little stressed and maybe you just want that fourth running back in case one of your guys gets hurt. Um, you could go a wide receiver. Like, there's a lot of things you can do here. For me personally, I'd say if someone like Jacoby Myers or Jerry Judy's on the board, get yourself a receiver. Like, yes, you're going to have six receivers here on your team, but at the end of the day, having more of them is beneficial because you can always trade them for even a lower end running back if you have a receiver that's performing and you necessarily like really need a running back at some point later on.
Yeah, so for me here in round 11, this is probably where I would try to um, you know, potentially solidify my running back crew, at this point. And I think you could get a guy like Chase Brown or Jerome Ford. You could potentially, maybe look at drafting a backup for one of the guys that you drafted earlier. And this is where I'd round out my running backs right here. And then in round 12, I would look at this is where I would look at one of two things. I would look at wide receiver or tight end. At this point, I think that there's going to be some wide receivers that fall down. I think that you could potentially get a Mitchell or a Lockett or a Judy in round 12. Um, and and let me take that back. If the, on round 11, if I couldn't get the running back that I wanted, like a Jerome Ford, I would definitely be switching up my strategy and drafting a wide receiver like Wiggs did in round 11, and snagging one of those guys there. Now, I'm going with the philosophy in this example that there is a fourth running back that I feel like would be a solid backup at the time, so that's why I did it. But if there wasn't, I would definitely be snagging a wide receiver in round 11 instead. But I switched it up a little bit here. So like round 12, I definitely would be looking at a wide receiver here and hoping that you know that some of these guys might drop down. Maybe a Jacoby Myers drops down. You never know. You got Palmer from the Chargers, Williams from the Jets. So there's some guys that could potentially drop down here. Some rookies that might drop down here that you can look at.
And then for me here in round 12, I'd be looking to round out my running back crew. In round 11, if someone were to drop down running back wise that I personally thought high of, like a Gus Edwards maybe in that round, I definitely would take him and flip flop these. It just kind of depends on what happens in your draft. So you do have to adapt a little bit, but I'd lock down my fourth running back here. I still think you have some decent options. You have Hubbard, Dobbins. You still have Gibson on the board, who I think later on in the draft is a nice one to look at. You have Dowdle, who, for all we know, might have a chance of getting some decent reps in Dallas this year, so you could take a chance there. Moving into round 13, I think I would end up taking probably my backup quarterback here. Um, just to play it safe and have myself a backup. You can get yourself like a Matthew Stafford or Aaron Rodgers later on. Deshaun Watson. You got a few other options with McCarthy and Mayfield still, but I feel like getting myself a quarterback here would be nice. You could make an argument for maybe a backup tight end, but for me, I always live by the philosophy of I can just get a tight end on my bye week.
Yeah, so for me, I know on the RB1, I think I drafted defense in round 13, but I kind of agree with Wiggs here, especially since I drafted my first quarterback in round 8. It's never a bad idea to have a backup quarterback. Depending on who the guy was that you drafted first. I could see Cousins dropping down to round 13, Stafford or Rodgers, definitely Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield. So I would probably go with quarterback here, in regards to that. And then round 14, I would probably draft a defense here, just to, uh, you know, try to get a higher end defense if there hasn't already been a defensive run, because as everybody knows, that sometimes these runs happen. But I would probably look at getting a defense here, at this point. If I didn't like anybody else that falls down, it always kind of changes for me depending on what players might fall down in those rounds. Because I'm always a big believer that you can always wait until round 15 and 16 for, well, definitely round 16 for your kicker and round 15 for your defense. But I'm going with the theory that there's nobody out there that, uh, that I would want, and that there's a defense out there, that I really liked, that I figured I could snag. And so I'll snag them at round 14.
Yeah, and then for me going into this round, I'd probably be looking to add one more receiver, have a little more depth there. Again, if you want to draft a backup tight end, go for it. You already have 6 receivers here. You have 4 running backs, 2 quarterbacks. Go for it if you want to draft a tight end. But for me, I'd rather run the risk right now of getting myself a backup wide receiver who has potential of having a good year. And if it was me personally, I'm super high on this sleeper, Darnell Mooney in round 14. That'd be my pick right there. I'm telling you. He's going to be nuts this year. And with Rondale Moore going down and being out for the season, he's going to get the ball. So he thinks I'm faded, but realistically, he's the faded one for doubting him.
Okay, move on. Round 15.
Round 15, obviously, would just be the defense. I'd be rounding it on out with the defense, or kicker, depending on what you want to do. And then my last round would just flip flop. Everyone has their opinion on it. I like picking kickers mostly more than defenses, but I might go the defensive route and just test the waters a little bit.
Yeah, so for me, round 15 would be one of two things. Like I said in the last video that we did, I would either be looking at a possible backup tight end or wide receiver, and it would have to be a tight end that I was really high on, to draft here, because I agree with Wiggs that you could probably play, the waiver wire, for that. But just for the sake of this round, let's say there's a tight end that's there. I would probably draft a tight end. You might be able to get a guy like Sanat from Washington, who's people are really high on. Who knows? Fryermuth could fall down. You got Kate Otten from Tampa Bay or a Taysom Hill from New Orleans. And then, last round, just like Wiggs, it'd be rounded off with a kicker. And going that direction. So, well, that kind of covers wide receiver heavy draft. Again, from what I've seen over the years, you're usually looking at at least six receivers. Uh, Most people I've seen in a heavy wide receiver one will take four running backs. I have seen people only take three running backs and go with seven wide receivers. Um, you know, uh, that's kind of a big risk, but I guess it all depends on when you draft it. I'm a big believer in if you're going with a certain strategy of heavy running backs or wide receivers, you're hopefully going to be snagging guys that might have potential trade value to fill in some of the gaps that you're maybe not comfortable with later and stuff. And that's what I um, look at too. Anyways, that's kind of my philosophy when it comes to this. Wiggs, any thoughts?
Oh, I think we're good to wrap it up.
All right. Well, hopefully you guys find value in this. Again, check us out on YouTube at Fantasy Fools PPR. Subscribe, like, follow. We're also out on Snapchat, X, Instagram, TikTok. Give us a follow, give us a like, subscribe. We definitely appreciate it. Any feedback is always welcome, and we just hope you guys find this valuable information.